Welcome back to Silicon Bites, and this is a long episode about a breaking news story. And this is the sabotage that we have just seen unfold in Poland. A railway track in eastern Poland that you've probably never heard of has been the target of apparent Russian hybrid terror operations. This track would have remained a matter of limited awareness to the world at large, but somebody tried to blow it up. Over the weekend, an explosion ripped through the Warsaw-Lublin line near the village of Mika, a line that doesn't just carry commuters and freight, but weapons and aid headed to Ukraine's front. Poland's Prime Minister is calling it an unprecedented act of sabotage. Investigators say it's almost certainly the work of foreign state services. And if you're thinking of Russia, you are likely not the only one. That's according to The Guardian. Before we jump into the story, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, especially at this time as we gear up to run our final events of the year. And also do check out the fantastic t-shirt store that we have partnered with to try and help raise money for Ukrainian defenders. You can find a link to our landing page, our partner page with the store, in the description of this channel on YouTube. And please do check them out. They have fantastic designs, and every t-shirt you buy will go towards helping Ukraine to remain resilient. Well, this attack in Poland isn't a one-off. It follows Russian drone incursions into Polish airspace. It follows arson attacks, cyber operations, and a steadily escalating hybrid war aimed at the logistics lifeline that keeps Ukraine fighting and Europe secure. Today's episode is about that shadow war and what it means when the supply routes to Ukraine get blown apart, even though it's not Ukrainian territory and infrastructure, and how Russia is launching an unprecedented informational campaign to muddy the waters and try to turn Poles against supporting Ukraine. So what actually happened on the tracks? Let's start with the basics. Over the weekend, a section of track on the Warsaw-Lublin railway line near Mika, roughly 100 kilometers southeast of Warsaw, was partially destroyed by an explosion. No train derailed, no one was killed, but that was sheer luck and vigilance, not by design. This act of terror could easily have led to multiple fatalities. A regional train driver noticed something wrong with the rails around 7:40 a.m. on Sunday, slowed down and stopped before hitting the gap in the track. That's from AP News. Polish officials say it's still unclear whether the device went off late Saturday night or in the early hours of Sunday. What is clear is that this was no accident. Donald Tusk, Poland's Prime Minister, went to the scene on Monday and confirmed that investigators had found evidence of an explosion and deliberate damage to the track. In a statement carried by AP, Tusk underlined the strategic importance of this particular line, saying it is crucially important for delivering aid to Ukraine. Again, that's from AP News. And there wasn't just a single incident. A second train carrying 475 passengers on the Swinoujście-Rzeszów route was forced into emergency stop later Sunday after overhead power cables were damaged and a metal brace was reportedly found on the line near Puławy, some 30 kilometers from the explosion site. Again, nobody was hurt. Again, police and security services are treating it as likely sabotage. Interior Minister Marcin Kierwiński says Poland has faced one confirmed act of sabotage and a second incident that is highly likely to be sabotage. Defense Minister Władysław Kosyniak-Kamysz has ordered the army to inspect 120 kilometers of track along the Warsaw-Lublin-Hubrzeszów line towards the Ukrainian border. That's in Reuters. And of course, anyone who's Polish watching this will have to forgive me for my atrocious pronunciation of all these place names. This isn't framed, however, as random vandalism. Politically, Warsaw is treating it as an attack on critical infrastructure on NATO's eastern flank during an ongoing war on their neighbour's territory. Foreign state services, not metal thieves. Officials are being careful with their wording, but not that careful. At a press conference in Warsaw, Poland's Special Services Coordinator Tomasz Siemoniak said the chances are very high that those who planted the explosives were acting on the orders of foreign intelligence services, but he stopped short of naming a country. Well, I'm sure many of us have the name of a particular country in mind. In a live blogged update, he sharpened the point. We are dealing with foreign state services, not a gang of scrap metal thieves. This quote was re-reported in The Guardian. Interior Minister Kierwiński posted on X that Poland is facing an act of sabotage unprecedented in its most recent history, calling this an act of aggression and promising that the guilty will be held to account. Again, quoted in The Guardian, Tusk himself has been more cautious in public about naming Russia, but he's already spent much of this year accusing Russian secret services of orchestrating arson and sabotage across Polish territory, from an enormous shopping centre fire in Warsaw in 2024 to plots against logistics hubs and warehouses. That's from Reuters. Even if the government is not formally pointing the finger at Moscow yet, the political and intelligence context is doing that work for them. On social media, there's no such restraint. Polish commentators, Ukrainian activists, and many Western security analysts are describing this very plainly as a Russian hybrid operation against the rail lifeline into Ukraine, an attempt to do by deniable sabotage what Russia hasn't managed to do with missiles and drones, sever the pipeline of Western weapons heading to Ukraine. The long campaign, arson, proxies, and disposable agents. The blast near Mika didn't come out of nowhere. It slots neatly into a well-documented pattern of Russian covert activity across Europe. Back in May, Polish authorities publicly accused Russian intelligence of ordering the arson attack that destroyed the Marywilska 44 shopping centre in Warsaw in 2024, a huge complex with around 1,400 shops, many run by members of the city's Vietnamese community. That decision came after a year-long investigation with multiple suspects already in custody and others still being hunted. That's according to AP News. Poland has since been on what you might call sabotage watch. In October alone, the country detained 8 people suspected of plotting attacks on behalf of Russia, including reconnaissance around military facilities and critical infrastructure. That's from Al Jazeera. In a separate case, 3 Ukrainian citizens were sentenced for arson as part of that crackdown, while investigators continue to dig into cross-border sabotage networks that link Poland, Lithuania, Germany, and beyond. A joint investigation by The Guardian earlier this year described how Russian intelligence increasingly outsources these tasks to online recruits, often vulnerable migrants, including Ukrainian refugees, who are given small, deniable jobs: film a warehouse, set a fire, place a device, buy a track. As one European security official put it, these people are disposable, expendable cutouts who can be sacrificed if they're caught. Well, that is from The Guardian. Germany's own security services have launched a public awareness campaign, literally titled "Don't Become a Disposable Agent," warning that people approaching online to carry out small tasks on behalf of Russian-linked actors can face prison sentences of up to 10 years. That's from AP News. When we look at a carefully placed explosive on a rail line that carries military cargo with no obvious profit motive in a country that's already unpicked Russian-run sabotage rings, it's not hard to see why Polish ministers are talking about foreign state actors. Rail Lifeline, why this line in particular matters. The Warsaw, Lublin, Hrubieszków line links Poland's capital to the Ukrainian border and connects into the wider web of tracks and roads feeding Ukraine's western railheads. From there, armoured vehicles, artillery shells, and humanitarian aid fan out across the country. And that's from AP News. A couple of years ago, Washington Post reporting, based on Western and Polish security officials, estimated that more than 80% of the military hardware delivered to Ukraine passes through Poland, much of it via a relatively narrow corridor of highways and rail lines linking to Rzeszów and Jasionka Airport and onwards to the border. That's the Washington Post. And anyone who's flown into Rzeszów will know very well that it is absolutely stuffed with air defense systems, etc., etc. Polish and NATO forces have spent the last 3 years strengthening that corridor. They've deployed Patriot batteries, air defense systems, drones, surveillance aircraft, and enough intelligence assets to make this stretch of eastern Poland one of the most closely watched pieces of real estate on the continent. That's according to Washington Post. And yet, as that Post investigation also showed, Russia has been trying to get at this lifeline for years, recruiting amateurs over Telegram to plant cameras near rail lines, scout airfields, and even, in a foiled plot, derail trains carrying weapons to Ukraine. That's the one we're reporting on today. Former US Army Europe commander Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired, told reporters back in 2023 that it was astounding that Russia had not been able to destroy a single convoy or train in motion, a failure that reflected both Ukrainian air defenses and perhaps also Moscow's reluctance to risk hitting NATO territory. So what has changed now? Why is Moscow suddenly so desperate to take far more elevated risks? Well, if you can't hit the trains directly without risking war with NATO, what do? You use sabotage, proxies, and plausible deniability to attack the infrastructure instead. And that's the playbook we're seeing now. Drones over Poland, from airspace violations to Article 4. And of course, this railway blast doesn't stand alone. It comes just 2 months after Russian drones spent a night buzzing deep inside Polish airspace. On the night of 9th to 10th September, Poland and NATO radars tracked around 19 to 21 Russian drones crossing into Polish territory as part of a wider attack on Western Poland, though they could hardly have strayed that far, that many drones into Polish airspace without it being, let's say, entirely intentional. Polish and Dutch aircraft shot several of them down. Debris damaged at least one house in the Lublin region. Poland closed airspace over multiple airports and later invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, forcing Allied consultations on that threat. That's from Wikipedia. Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski described the incursion as tactically stupid and counterproductive, arguing that it had brought nothing but galvanizing Western opinion against Russia. That's from The Guardian. Analysts quoted by the Washington Post and others described that drone wave as a classic test of NATO's readiness, a way to map response times, radar coverage, and political reactions. Maciej Bukowski at SIPA summed up Moscow's strategy in a phrase: the Kremlin is using an old playbook on a grander scale. Poke your enemy and see how he responds. And this hasn't been the only scare. In August, an unidentified object, likely a drone or part of a drone, exploded in a field near Osyny in eastern Poland. Defense Minister Kosiniak-Kamysz openly said that sabotage could not be ruled out and called it a deliberate provocation. That's quoted in AP News. When you stitch that timeline together, drone incursions in September, unexplained explosions in August, and now a bomb on a rail line to Ukraine in November, you see a steadily ratcheting up of hybrid pressure on Poland right up against NATO's red lines without quite crossing into an overt, kinetic military attack. Well, how does this fit in with the wider hybrid toolkit? Hacking cameras, shadow fleets, and underground cells. The railway sabotage is physical, it is kinetic, but it sits on top of a bigger hybrid toolkit that Russia has been using against Ukraine's supporters. Back in May, the UK and a coalition of Western cyber agencies published an advisory accusing GRU Unit 26165, better known as APT28 or Fancy Bear, of hacking into about 10,000 security cameras in Europe and Ukraine, including cameras near border crossings, military facilities, and railway stations. The goal to monitor and disrupt the flow of aid and weapons into Ukraine and to steal sensitive logistics data like shipping manifests and rail schedules. That's in The Guardian. European intelligence services have also documented a surge in suspected Russian sabotage operations, fires at warehouses and shopping centres, as we mentioned earlier, attempts to damage undersea cables and pipelines, arson attacks on defence-related businesses, and plots to interfere with cargo aircraft. That's all from Wikipedia. Poland has been a key target in that campaign, both because it is the main logistics hub for Ukraine and because Warsaw has, under both the previous right-wing government and the current centrist coalition, positioned itself as one of Kiev's most committed backers. Again, Washington Post. What we're watching, in other words, is the continuation of the same strategy by other means. If missiles and drones can't reliably stop the weapons reaching Ukraine, hybrid war will try to make the cost of supporting Ukraine politically, economically, psychologically as high as possible. Europe reacts, unity, fear, and politics. Domestically, Poland has gone into security state mode. Kierwiński has convened an emergency meeting of ministers, police chiefs, and intelligence heads. Tusk is chairing the National Security Committee, and the government is openly discussing raising the national threat level. Justice Minister Waldemar Żurek says investigators are treating the rail incidents as an attempt to cause a disaster in land traffic, a charge that could carry up to life imprisonment. That's in The Guardian. On X, Tusk posted a photo of himself at the blast site, promising we will catch the perpetrators, whoever they are. That's Washington Post. From Estonia, Prime Minister Kristen Michal was one of the first to weigh in publicly, writing that Estonia stands with Poland and Donald Tusk and that the EU and NATO response to such incidents must be united. That was reported in The Guardian. In Brussels, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen already warning in a separate letter about permanent threats to European democracies and the need to sustain support for Ukraine, and is now facing a concrete case that shows what those threats look like in practice: bombs on tracks, drones in airspace, arson in shopping malls. There's also the deterrence debate. The September drone incursion led Poland to push hard inside NATO for tougher responses, from extending Allied air defence coverage over western Ukraine to bolstering deployments on the eastern flank, to stricter enforcement of sanctions against Russia's drone and missile supply chains. Analysts like Bukowski argue that merely intercepting drones and cleaning up after sabotage is not enough. NATO must make every violation costly for Moscow. That is printed in SIPA. At the same time, there's the domestic political angle. Polish society remains broadly supportive of Ukraine, but Russian operations clearly aim to stir resentment, using proxies from marginalized communities, hoping Poles will blame Ukrainians or migrants for the chaos. That's the same method we saw in the earlier GRU plot, using Ukrainian refugees as sabotage recruits, and in online campaigns pushing messages like Poland does not equal Ukraine and NATO go home. This was described in detail in the Washington Post. And there is a secondary explosion, or at least an echo of the main kinetic blast. It's in the disinformation offensive that has exploded in Polish social media to accompany the terror act. Within hours of Donald Tusk announcing what had happened near the village of Mika was an akt dywersji, or an act of sabotage, most likely aimed at blowing up a passenger train, the Polish government started doing something very telling, warning people not just about more bombs and to be vigilant, but about more lies and to be wary of weaponized information. On the official channels of the Prime Minister's office and the Interior Ministry, a graphic starts circulating, a bright warning triangle and a short text in Polish. false information about the act of sabotage on the Warsaw Lublin line may appear online. This is a moment when it's easy to fall victim to manipulation. That sounds like a government that knows it is under coordinated attack offline and online and is trying to pre-bunk the next wave. Polish security experts are saying the quiet part out loud now. On the liberal talk station Talk FM, security analyst Dr. Bartosz Maziarz from the University of Opole walks listeners through the sabotage and immediately connects it with the information war. He calls this exactly what it is, part of an ongoing hybrid conflict, and he warns that in the next few hours people should expect all kinds of disinformation actions online aimed at undermining trust in state institutions. He tells listeners that social media, comment sections, random screenshots is one of the tools through which disinformation will be sown. The attack has two layers: a physical attack on critical infrastructure that supports Ukraine, a parallel attack on Polish social cohesion and confidence in the state. It's the same playbook Russia has been refining for years, yet we still seem not to be prepared to counter it. Perhaps tackling the kinetic part of such an attack is very difficult to do, continent-wide especially, but we should be preparing for the informational attacks, which predictably always come a lot more seriously. So, a hybrid campaign, years in the making. Poland has been on the front line of a hybrid informational war since 2022, as weapons convoys rolled east, flowing through Rzeszów, and Ukrainian displaced people westwards. It has always been a prime target for Moscow's informational operations. Australian-Russian expert Matthew Sussex wrote last year that Polish officials on the refugee front line were being bombarded with spoofed calls, fake NGO offers, and bogus messages about phantom trains, all designed to waste resources, confuse responders, and erode public trust. He described a wider campaign of Russian disinformation in Poland that went from crude lies, such as Ukrainians taking your hospital beds, your jobs, your homes, to much more insidious efforts, fake surveys by fake institutions, deepening social fault lines, and pushing narratives that Poland is secretly plotting to annex Western Ukraine or is already at war with Russia. Crucially, Sussex warned that disinformation is now morphing into subversion and outright sabotage, with evidence of Russian proxies tasked to attack aid convoys and derail trains heading for Ukraine. Fast forward to November 2025, an explosive charge under a track on the Warsaw-Lublin line, a route that local analysts point out is one of the main corridors for ammunition and equipment heading to Ukraine via the Dorohusk border crossing. The immediate info battle. Here are three narratives to watch. So what does this disinformation campaign actually look like? Let's be clear. It's still early. Much of the Polish language campaign is happening on Telegram channels, Facebook groups, and X threads that we only see in fragments. And of course, they are in the Polish language, which makes research more difficult for those outside of the country. But based on patterns documented by Polish and international researchers, several classic narratives tend to be spun up around incidents like these. One, blame Ukraine, push the idea that this is Ukrainian sabotage or some rogue Ukrainian actors trying to drag NATO into the war. This taps into older, well-documented Russian narratives about ungrateful Ukrainians biting the hand that feeds them and about Poland being foolishly loyal to Kiev. Two, the state is lying or incompetent. Question whether it was sabotage at all, suggest it was just a maintenance failure covered up as terrorism to distract from government scandals, or flip it, insist that it was sabotage, but that it proves that Tusk's government left Poland undefended, sacked the good security services, and cares more about liberal niceties than security. Narrative number 3, it's all a false flag. Hint or openly claim that the government staged or allowed the attack to justify crackdowns, more spending on the military, or to smear the opposition as Russian supporters. This is especially toxic in a country where public debate is already hyper-polarized after 8 years of PIS rule and a vicious, hostile divide between left and right-leaning communities in Poland. None of this is speculative. Polish analysts and Western think tanks have been tracking identical narratives around the Russian drone incursion into Poland in September, when around 20 Russian drones violated Polish airspace and NATO jets were scrambled to shoot them down. Media like Meduza and Sky News reported at the time how Moscow's line oscillated between denial, minimization, and claims the drones were harmless or lost, while sympathetic voices online accused Warsaw and NATO of overreacting and trying to escalate. The sabotage near Mika fits neatly into that hybrid toolbox. Push a risky, provocative operation right up to the threshold of war, then drown the debate that follows in contradictory noise. Well, let's turn then to domestic spin and the Kremlin-friendly echo chambers. Then there is homegrown disinformation, opportunistic but useful to Moscow. Within hours of the sabotage being confirmed, former Justice Minister Zbigniew Ziobro jumped on social media to claim that the acts of sabotage are essentially the government's fault. The results, he suggests, of Tusk dismantling the Pegasus spyware system, which PIS once touted as an anti-terrorism tool. Ziobro does what populists do. He uses a national security shock to punch the same old buttons. A centrist MEP from PSL, Krzysztof Hetman, calls Ziobro's intervention the absolute height of irresponsibility and points out the obvious. Ziobro is currently hiding from Polish justice in Viktor Orban's Hungary, a government openly friendly with Vladimir Putin. We see a classic pattern unfolding with opportunistic populists on the extremes of left and right, Kremlin-linked actors, seed narratives, and Russian-friendly themes. Domestic extremists, opportunists, and grifters amplify, adapt, and localize these stories. The result is the same: confusion, anger, fragmentation, and a Polish public less able to unite around the basic fact that someone tried to blow up a train and could easily have killed large numbers of people. Popular pro-democracy accounts on X, like the Warsaw-based activists who've been campaigning under the Silny Razem, Strong Together hashtag, are amplifying the government's warning graphics, urging followers to check sources, not share screenshots from random Telegram channels, and to treat anything that blames Ukrainians or suggests a Tusk false flag as a giant red flag for Russian influence. One widely shared post from a pro-government account puts it bluntly: the second part of the attack has begun, the informational one. Now the target are our heads. Meanwhile, mainstream outlets are publishing explainers with headlines like "Poland is under attack" and walking listeners through the 100,000 cyber attacks on Polish systems in 2024 alone, most of them targeting rail signalling, ticketing systems, and energy networks. They explicitly connect the dots. Arson of warehouses, attempted derailment, the drone incursion, now this bombing on the rail line. It's a campaign, not a series of coincidences. This is not just a sabotage story, but hybrid terror, information and psychology operations. It's about whether Poland and its allies can manage the fear and anger from these attacks without turning on each other and without letting Russia's political objectives succeed where its missiles have failed. We must not forget Russia's mastery at the strategy of divide and conquer. Blowing up a section of track that carries weapons to a country fighting an existential defensive war is not just sabotage. It is an attack on Ukraine's ability to survive, on Europe's credibility, and on the idea that NATO territory is off limits. Whether the bomb was planted by a Russian officer or by some Telegram-recruited cutout does not change the strategic intent. This is the same Russia whose drones have already crisscrossed Polish airspace, the same Russia whose intelligence services have, according to Polish investigators, ordered arson attacks on civilian infrastructure, the same Russia whose cyber hackers pry into border cameras to watch convoys roll east. Put that together, and the pattern is not subtle. Well, some of this was taken from Wikipedia. The question now is whether Europe treats this as background noise, another incident in a long and lengthening list, or what it really is, a test of whether we're serious when we say Ukraine's survival and NATO's security are non-negotiable. The next time you hear a politician mumble about fatigue on Ukraine or overstretch on defence spending, remember that our adversary felt bold enough to put explosives on the rails carrying ammunition to Ukrainian soldiers. But also, that line carries civilian trains travelling peacefully around eastern Poland. It is also a signal that Moscow is getting desperate in its losing war with Ukraine and will now raise the stakes, increase the risks to try and deter allies from assisting Ukraine. We should not only be vigilant, we should strike back.